Hello and welcome to the Small Business Briefing. I'm Brian Calley, CEO of the Small Business Association of Michigan.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Sarah Miller, Vice President of Communications at SBAM, and I want to say welcome to one of our new elite members, Kristen McKinnon of Lovewell Home Care in Heartland. We appreciate your membership. All right, so Brian, I think we really need to start with the biggest issue in front of us this week. We are really on the countdown. The Earned Sick Time Act is scheduled to take effect on Friday, but there was some action late last week. So let's start there. What happened?
Yeah, there was some movement, and it was really spurred on when the Speaker of the House did kind of a free-flowing press conference and really did kind of up the stakes or draw attention to the fact that we are really under the gun when it comes to the tipped wage credit, minimum wage changes, and the Earned Sick Time Act. And the legislature has been debating whether or not to make changes for literally months on end and to really just kind of demand that things either start moving or being honest with people that they're not going to. And so that the Senate did take up a compromise position on the minimum wage and the tipped wage credit portion of this debate. And to be real blunt about it, that's the easier lift of the two. Okay, it's less complex, and there's more general agreement where restaurant servers and bartenders and people who own bars and restaurants seem to mostly or almost across the board agree that they don't want to scrap the current system, that those that are working to change it are not doing it on behalf of workers in those professions. In fact, are working against the interests of workers in those professions. And so they passed a bill to deal with that portion of the problem. Here's what that bill does. It just went from the Senate over to the House. I just want to make perfectly clear that this is not a done deal, but it is something that at least moved out of the Senate, which is the main problem when it comes to fixing these issues. Remember, the House already passed legislation to deal with both of these problems, waiting on the Senate to do something. Now, so they changed it. They made two main changes. First is they preserved the tipped wage credit, and while it will go up, it'll go up at a much slower pace and cap out at 50%. If you don't own a bar or restaurant, you don't really need to know what that means, but instead of it being eliminated altogether, it will be preserved in place, but the tipped wage credit will be diminished by the rate being increased. Okay, so but it will increase at a smaller rate and top out at 50% instead of topping out at 100%, which essentially eliminates it altogether. Again, if you're not in the restaurant or bar industry, you don't really need to know what that means, but just understand that that is part of a package. Now, the other big part that will affect more employers is that they actually, in that same legislation, the compromise was that they would speed up the increase of the regular minimum wage. So on the one hand, while they're preserving the kind of spirit and structure of the tipped wage system for bars and restaurants, instead of the minimum wage ramping up to $15 in 4 years, it will instead ramp up to $15 in 3 years. Okay, so that's all contained in one bill. It's called Senate Bill 8, and it passed out of the Senate. It went over to the House. But Senate Bill 8 is tie-barred. This is a legislative maneuver where they connect it to another piece of legislation to where neither can become law unless both become law. And they tie-barred it to House Bill 4002, which are the fixes that we're asking for with respect to the Earned Sick Time Act. That is a much heavier lift than the minimum wage. And so what that tie bar says, when they tied these two things together, what it said is that the leaders on both sides of the Capitol are committed to not leaving us behind, that they're going to negotiate that this week. This is a big, big week with respect to the Earned Sick Time Act. I don't want to get your hopes up, though, that there's any chance that it won't go into effect on Friday. It's going to go into effect on Friday. The question is, do they take steps to mitigate the negative impacts on small businesses before then? Okay, so they're not considering repeal of it. Repeal is not on the table. The governor wouldn't sign that. The Senate wouldn't pass it. The House might pass it, but that's an academic discussion. It's not going to be repealed. So you're going to have to be ready to implement on Friday. Worst case scenario is everything stays the same. Best case scenario is that perhaps some changes are made to ease the implementation of it, even though the main structure of it will most certainly stay in place.
So Brian, what do you think are the main obstacles to getting a deal done?
Well, the big issue really is whether or not I would say the di most difficult issue happens to be our most important issue from a small business standpoint. Traditionally, these types of laws have a small business exemption, and it recognizes that labor laws are much more difficult when you have a smaller workforce. So if you have people that can't make it to work and you have 500 employees to kind of make up the difference, that's a lot different than if you have 7 employees to make up the difference. And so like these types of labor laws normally have a small business exemption. And so we want that small business exemption. The Senate and the sponsor of legislation that was introduced in the Senate, Senator Singh of East Lansing seems absolutely dead set against, determined not to allow any small business exemption whatsoever. In fact, has signaled a willingness to let just everything, the whole deal, blow up if a small business exemption is kept in place. Um, we're having a hard time kind of understanding that perspective. Why so rigid? Why so anti-small business? But nevertheless, it's a reality that we're dealing with in the Senate. The Senate is absolutely the hold up, the obstacle to any sort of relief at all being provided with respect to the Earned Sick Time Act. But we're hopeful still. The fact that the Senate Majority Leader had signed on to the minimum wage, the tipped wage credit fix, basically in exchange for a faster ramp up in the regular minimum wage, it means that there's still an active negotiation. That means that it's possible that something uh, will pass before Friday when the deadline hits. But at this point, it's really hinges, I think, um, on these issues of exemptions and whether it applies broadly across the board, whether it applies equally to all employees, or if there's a difference between, full and part-time and that sort of thing. Right now, it's every single employer, well, except for this U.S. federal government, but every single employer and um, and right across the board when it comes to every different type of employee. It could be seasonal or part-time or full-time, just really as broad a scope as you can imagine. That's today's law. And really, I think the biggest obstacle is settling on whether or not employers are allowed to have any sort of exemptions. Are they allowed to treat um, full-time employees? Are they allowed to give them better benefits than part-time employees? Those are the sorts of things, the normal employment practices that this law really puts into question.
All right, so I know you said ESTA's happening on Friday, but is there any chance that something will get passed this week?
Well, I think there is a chance, and I think the chance that having a small business exemption in it are very small, approaching zero. But the other things that we'd like to see happen, things like more explicitly allowing these combined leave banks where you don't have to separate out vacation and sick time. Uh, Also, relieving accrual requirements on businesses that front end load the benefits. So you give all the days you're supposed to give right up front and don't make the business jump through all the hoops of calculating accruals, maybe some limits on what gets carried over, but especially I would say that really our second biggest issue, other than the small business exemption, is allowing businesses, employers, especially small businesses, to establish time and attendance policies, which really are thrown into question with the law as it exists today, too. Those are the sorts of things I think there is at least some chance that they happen. Probably, if you were to ask me 2 weeks ago, I would have said a 1 in 5 chance. After what happened last week, I would up that to about an even 50-50 type chance. I think there's just as good a chance that something passes as there is that it doesn't. There have been definitely signals that have been sent to the legislators to not make any plans on Thursday and late Thursday night and into Friday morning that they're determined to hang around there until they find some sort of a deal in order to make in order to lessen the negative impacts on small businesses especially. And I think what's happened is people were pretty rigid a couple of weeks ago, but now when it's like when it's really is here's the deadline, I think there are more legislators that before didn't want to make any changes that now are like, wow, we're going to own the outcomes of this. There's going to be negative ramifications and there'll be nobody to blame except for the legislators themselves who stood in the way of making these changes. I think that deadline looming and just the realness of it and the amount of feedback that our people have sent into the system. We've had great responses. The To our calls to action. I think it does have them not wanting to own the outcome, the negative ramifications to this policy.
And we did issue another call to action early this morning, and I shared the link here in the chat. If you're watching this later, you can just find it on our homepage under advocacy, but please share your story and add your voice to that. Like Brian said, it is working. There's been some confusion around ESTA 2. A few weeks ago, people were confused because it passed out of the House. And now there's some confusion regarding some comments about about delays. So can you talk about what those delay headlines mean and what those are all about?
Yeah, last week the governor was on a trade mission and did some interviews with Michigan media and suggested, well, maybe if there's not an agreement on the Earned Sick Time Act, there could be a delay. And that was a headline, the governor proposes delay. And I think understandably, people read a headline like that and they think that there is a delay. There is not a delay. There is not going to be a delay. The governor did in fact suggest that that is one avenue that could be taken. The Senate in particular seemed to have really kind of spiked that idea right out of the blocks. Like it's not a conversation, it's not something they're willing to entertain, and it would absolutely require there to be there to be legislation passed. Because remember, this deadline that we're facing on February 21st, you will not find that deadline anywhere in law. It was set by the Michigan Supreme Court. So this is under a court order. It's really kind of tricky in how the legislature could extend a deadline that is established by the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court had made a decision that was based in Michigan law, then the legislature could maybe change that law. But in this case, they didn't. That the February 21st date is one that is purely of construction of a court decision. And so anyway, even if it wasn't, I don't think the Senate was going to seriously entertain the notion anyhow. And so you can really just ignore the headlines that you saw about a delay. That is not going to happen.
All right, and we are continuing to
Well,
educate our.
let me say one more
Oh,
thing, Sarah,
yeah,
that
go ahead.
if something came together um, on Thursday or Friday and they didn't find an agreement, but then they at push came to shove and they found a way to delay it, I will be very happy to eat my words on that. Just to make clear, I don't think that a delay is in the cards at all, but I would absolutely love to be wrong about that.
Yes, agreed. I think we all would like you to be wrong about that. All right, so we do have a couple of webinar opportunities coming up. We're continuing our compliance series. You and our Director of HR, Scout Sparks, have been hosting these compliance webinars for our members. We have our seventh version is coming up this week. And then Brian, do you want to talk a little bit about another opportunity we have from the advocacy side happening next week? And I'll drop both links in the chat.
Yeah, very good. So we have a couple of different webinars coming up, and we would invite you to participate in either or both of them, but they're different purposes. So if you've already attended some of our compliance webinars, that's really what Thursday's webinar is about. And we'll probably have a pretty good idea of if there's going to be changes. And by the way, if there are changes, and you've utilized our toolkit or you have access to our toolkit on ESTA compliance, we will make the modifications and send them out to everybody, make them um, very available to the extent that there are changes that are made. On Monday, though, what we want to do is more of a policy and a political update. So not really talking about compliance, but really laying out where things landed and where we go from here. So we don't know exactly what the contents of that webinar will be because we don't know how this week is going to go. But we know that you'll be very interested in this as employers, or anybody who has employees anyway, is going to be very interested in a discussion on how this landed, what the final political solution, if any, came to be, and then if there are steps or where we go from here, how we regroup, and what the next game plan is. So would love to have you a part of that discussion. It'll be kind of the conclusion, the conclusion to one chapter, and then opening up the chapter from if there is any additional action that can or should be taken from that point forward. So would love to have you participate in both of those as we as we round up the work and describe really the hard work that we do on your behalf over the course of this next week.
All right. In addition to other hard work that we're working on here is ramping up advocacy against the governor's proposal to increase business taxes as part of the roads deal. We issued this call to action a week ago. So where do things stand right now?
Well, I'm feeling a lot better about the business tax increase proposal. We went on what I consider to be just a major education update on the corporate income tax. There was a big misconception that the corporate income tax is only paid by publicly traded companies, C corporations that are these huge multinational companies. But really, when you dig into the facts on this, you find that 87% of those corporate income taxpayers have fewer than 100 employees. And that means that really it is primarily most of these taxpayers under that tax code are small businesses. And I was pretty confident that if we got that word out to people, that people would pretty quickly back off the proposal. It's one thing to say, oh yeah, these nameless, faceless uh, huge corporations that really don't, aren't really present here, are not really a part of Michigan in any substantial way. Although we do have some, by the way, big, huge multinational publicly traded companies in Michigan, and we're lucky to have them here. But but people kind of think of it that way. That's not the corporate income tax. So I'm feeling pretty good. While everybody was working on ESTA, we were just doing a lot of good educational work, and and we've seen the tone of that conversation change quite a bit. We saw over 4,000, I think about 4,500 responses to our calls to action that went into the policymakers saying, hey, listen, we're not going to, don't go this direction. You need to fix roads, fix it in a way that is evenly spread across everybody. Don't single out small businesses and say it's just their responsibility. So I would say we made some good progress. The threat's not over. We are going to continue to work to ensure that any road solution isn't just on small businesses, but is something that's more fairly spread across everybody who uses roads. The the other parts of that proposal that maybe didn't get as much attention that I think probably do deserve some. One is in a vertical trade, so the marijuana industry. The governor did propose a wholesale tax on the marijuana industry that would raise those of 40%. That would raise about $470 million for roads is the idea. I remember a few years ago there was a reporter that coined the phrase "pot for potholes." And it was kind of funny to see that actually kind of come to fruition. I don't know how realistic that is. The marijuana industry is on the ropes right now. Um, the the governor's team points to Michigan's tax on retail sale of 10% of the gross is lower than some other states, and it is lower than some other states. But I think this would actually put Michigan the highest in the country, but also an industry that is fledgling right now. There are so many bankruptcies and marijuana companies going out of business. I'm not really sure that well is as deep as maybe they think it is. And then the final new tax that was part of that proposal is one that we probably wouldn't get heavily engaged in anyway, is on large tech companies, so those with more than $100 million in sales. So really, you're talking about like Google, Facebook, anybody who places digital ads. The state of Maryland had implemented a tax on digital ads that touch IP addresses in Maryland, and they assess essentially a take on that, like a revenue sharing of 10% of the gross revenue for those. I'm not sure what their tax was, but in Michigan, I think that's what was being proposed. And so that was yet another piece of that of the governor's proposal on funding roads. So um, I have no idea what the odds of something like that happening. Only one other state has attempted a tax like that, and it has been questioned in court. I will say that in the state won in the court challenge on that. States can tax that way. I think there was a Supreme Court precedent that was set called the Wayfair decision that allowed states to tax based on what they call an economic nexus or an economic presence. So even if Facebook didn't have a physical presence in Michigan, they could tax them for economic presence here, like placing ads that hit IP addresses in our state. So that's another avenue that was kind of, I don't want to say left field. It's been talked about in tax policy arenas, but not something that had ever been proposed here in Michigan before. So I suppose um, that'll be debated as well. But our main focus is going to still be on the corporate income tax and make sure that a general business tax is not the way they fund roads, that they do so based on something that would more closely relate to the use of roads, things like registration fees and gas taxes, the ways that distribute the taxes, whether it's a business or an individual using the road, you kind of pay based on your use, is a system that we're quite comfortable with, according to SBM's established policies, but not one that singles out business.
All right, so we definitely have our hands full here in Michigan with a lot of things to keep track of, but let's check in at the federal level as well. What noteworthy orders came down last week?
Well, the one that I thought I might mention this week is regarding reciprocal tariffs. So it's a policy rather than establishing a particular percentage on another country, like steel and aluminum tariffs of 25%, for example, the president established that the week before. So it's a specific percentage on a specific item for any country that's importing steel or aluminum into the US. A reciprocal tariff system is different. What it says is whatever the other country does to US imports will happen or to US exports into those countries will happen when that country's companies import into the US. This has been talked about a lot. I don't know of any instance where it's actually been done. So it is really um, it's like a built-in system where it would be difficult for another country to instigate a trade war, if you will, in the normal sense, where one does a percentage and the other one ups a percentage, and the other ups a percentage. In this case, like whatever the other country does, the US just matches it on an import-export basis. So I don't really know how that will turn out. I think it will definitely raise a bunch of issues to the surface, particularly trade with Europe, where Europe has made it very difficult to sell into that continent for some time now. And they do so in a couple of different ways. One is with import tariffs. Another one was a tax system called a value added tax, or a VAT tax. And that's a very complicated way of taxing, but it's one that can be used kind of like a tariff. And so I think that you're probably going to see some quick kind of back and forth and diplomacy in countries that are trying to perhaps negotiate a settlement to be taken outside of this policy, particularly those that impose much higher tariffs on U.S. goods than they do than the U.S. does on those countries. So it feels big to me, but again, I don't have anything to compare it to. That policy change is big, and um, it could result in a some big changes, and what those changes could be. I know the president wants to see more domestic manufacturing to be one of the outcomes from it. You could see, um, because of it, higher prices. What's interesting though is that, when we look at it, there's higher prices and then there's higher income. And the real question is, does income grow faster than inflation? And I think that's the dynamic part, that it's just too hard to predict and what will happen. So it is a big, I would say in some ways it's a big risk to do a policy, to implement a policy like that. But I know that that the economic advisors and the new administration think that's a risk that's worth taking, because the status quo has resulted in a pretty big transfer of wealth outside of the country to pretty much everywhere else in the world. So stay tuned on that, but really a pretty big change. If you're not an importer or exporter, then you probably in the short term won't notice any sort of difference on this. But companies like automotive companies, for example, that have supply chains that stretch around the globe, they'll be scrambling for a while to figure out what they want to make adjustment for and what they leave the same. And by the way, when back in the original Trump administration, I think they inadvertently left the door open to resourcing products. Like a product there'd be one country with a tariff, and they'd move that product to another country and then import it from that country to the U.S. This policy is very uh, wide. When I read the executive order, it seems to close every single door to kind of work a workaround. And so stay tuned. We'll keep close track on that and see um, as the situation develops.
All right, let's go to our 2026 election watch coverage.
All right. Actually, amazingly, hardly anything happened last week on that front. So the Attorney General, who's probably going to be a candidate for U.S. Senate, had gotten involved in a lawsuit against the U.S. federal government with 14 other state attorneys general, trying to block some of the activities of the Trump administration. But on the one hand, I say it's kind of a move maybe to get some attention, but I think that even if she wasn't running, she probably would have done the same thing. So really a surprisingly quiet week on the election front, where we saw the lead up before this, tons and tons of actions and updates, a little bit of a breather.
All right, then that gives us enough time for today's Data Monday.
All right, so I'm gonna run through these relatively quick. We haven't done one of these in a while, and there are some pretty important updates. First is the jobs report. And you'll notice here on this jobs report that that these last couple months, if I don't know if you remember, but they actually got adjusted upward. Okay, so this is through January, a little lower month, 143, but not as low as some of the other months leading into the second half of last year. So I kind of look at this whole report. Everything we're looking at today is like a baseline. This for the month of January. So this would be the last month of the Biden administration, and heading into the Trump administration. Probably a pretty good baseline month. Think of it in those terms. So on the jobs front, you'll see this is the same data presented in two different ways: goods versus services over on the right, and on the left, just the high to low. You will notice that government and number three, highest job producer, and education and healthcare services, which are very highly reliant on government spending. I think if there was a short-term place where you would see, say in the next 6 months, an impact from the new presidential administration, it would probably be those line items that had heavy government spending, perhaps curtailed some. So in next month's jobs report, it's the first thing I'm going to look at, just to see whether or not you see those, like this government jobs increase has, as long as the last 2 years, it's been in the top three of the this category, and seems like maybe it won't be in the next 6 months or so. The unemployment rate at 4%. So this is the national rate, came down. So remember, Michigan's is up more like 5%. The national rate about 4%, pretty good. And then the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and the CPI is coming in at 3%. And then that core inflation at 3.3. So you see that CPI went up some, and mainly tied to commodities, but I'm not so alarmed by that because that core is still pretty even for several months in a row at 3.3%. That's the one that's really, I think, more traditionally that you look at more traditionally. Now, if you look at services versus goods, you see that goods in the blue is still slightly in deflationary territory, but coming back up to zero. So it's at negative 0.1 year over year. And then goods, services inflation at 4.3, but you see that it's coming down. Another reason why I think interest rates aren't going to change dramatically this year, that they'll probably be holding steady because, well, things they're not going quite where you would want to see them on a monetary policy basis, but they're also there's nothing alarming about them either. They're just kind of like stuck right here. Now, looking at the categories of what moved, the same. We don't have much time, so I won't dwell on this, but you can see all items at 3%, and here are the things that are above, and here are the things that are below. And then looking at three different measures of inflation. So you've got the consumer price index and then the producer price index, along with the personal consumption expenditure, the PCE. So all three of those, are looking, I would say, just pretty stable at the moment. But again, all too high, but stable, with maybe the exception of the producer price index is showing some upward pressure. And then labor force participation, just a couple more slides here, at 62.6%. And you'll see that's the top slide, the part of the slide. The bottom half of the slide separates out among men and women. And you'll see both of those look pretty stable, a little bit of an uptick. Remember, before we were pretty disappointed to see it decline a bit, but actually a bit of an uptick overall in this last report. And then looking at the prime labor force section, 25 to 54-year-old workers, and that had fallen off some, but now actually turned the corner a little bit. So holding steady at 83.5%, which is a pretty good labor force participation rate for that category, as you see the history there. So looking at everything, I'd say, stuff looks pretty stable to me, pretty good baseline type year. I wish that inflation was continuing to go down. It's just not. It seems to be stuck where it's at, which tells me that that don't expect any dramatic changes in interest rates anytime soon until you really start seeing those, especially those core rates of inflation, start to decline again.
All right, well, that is everything we have for you today. We appreciate you tuning in. We'll be back here next Monday at 3 o'clock. We'll keep you updated on NESTA. Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.